All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this talk this afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Joe. Um, as Joe said, I'm Katelyn King, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about using historical data to build understanding of changes in fish species over time. First, I'm just going to give a brief overview of how climate affects fishes. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why historical data are important. Then we'll look at how we can use these data to look at changes in fish abundance and how abundance and composition relates to changing temperature over time. So first of all, we've seen over the past around 70 years increases in air temperatures, especially in the Midwest. So this map just gives you a quick overview of change in temperatures across 70 years from the Climate Science Special Report. And you can see I've highlighted Michigan there. So Michigan is mostly that dark and light colored red, which show increases in temperatures, in air temperatures over time. And so increasing in air temperature in turn is going to increase in water temperatures. And so this is a map from another study that looked at changing in water temperature over time. And again, Michigan's got mostly that red and orange color there for those temperatures in those lakes that they had study data for. And so these increases in water temperature have shifted distributions and abundance of many both terrestrial and aquatic species in the recent decades. And temperature is really important, especially for fish species distributions and community compositions, because it affects some of those processes that fish have important for fish, such as like breeding and growth and feeding. And so fish usually have their ideal temperature. And I love this graphic because it shows you some of the common fish species and what their like preferred temperature range is. And so if we think about climate changing and the water's warming, then we can predict that species, some of these cool and cold water species like walleye and cisco, their habitat is really going to decrease as waters get warmer, whereas it might be favored for something like largemouth bass, which prefer warmer temperatures. And so researchers often use a modeling approach called species distribution models to think about how species distributions and abundance might change with changing climate. And so this is a graphic to show kind of how that modeling works. And the model takes species where they occur, where they're seen as points, and overlays those observed points with any amount of variables that you might have for your study region. So things like terrain, climate, soils, land covers, those are just a few examples. And then the model has this output of suitability. So where from 0 to 1, where would be those most suitable habitat in the future, depending on these environmental variables and where we've seen that species in current times. So a lot of studies use these species distribution models. Here's an example of one study that looked at 3 different freshwater species. So they have smallmouth bass there at the top, walleye in the middle, and cisco at the bottom. And they're looking at 2050 and 2070 for these different species, and where that habitat would be very suitable in red and not very suitable in blue. So this study uses the occurrence of species, so where are they found? But one thing that might be really important and that might change with climate is thinking about abundance. So not just where a species is present or absent, but how many species are in that population in that particular area. And if you think about how this could be really important from a management perspective, changes in abundance could reveal declining populations before that local extinction, and managers could then direct their resources towards that species or towards specific lakes to try to kind of prevent that downfall before they're just not there anymore. But one thing that's really hard is to get good data to predict abundance. So you need to be able to know how much effort and what types of gear have been used to collect fish species in order to predict abundance. And this is really hard to get, and especially if you're thinking about changing in time and needing both historical and current data to look at those temporal trends. So historical species data could be really important in looking at trends over time. If we think about comparing the current species distribution to some sort of baseline, we can only have that baseline depending on where our current knowledge is at the moment. So the more data we have, the better we're able to set baselines. Along with that, we can use these data to support comparisons of past and present habitats. So we can look at those changes in biodiversity over time. And like I said before, target those restoration efforts in those places. However, getting historical data in a usable format can be very difficult. So a lot of data is stored in paper format or on maps. And so digitizing this data so that it can be analyzed can be really time consuming and expensive. There are some tools like optical character recognition, these AI tools that can kind of scrape text off of documents that are scanned in. But it can come with a lot of errors, and quality check is very time consuming, especially data that might be handwritten or in tables that can be really hard to capture. So our goal was to look at changes in species abundance over time, and especially in related to a changing climate. And so we had 3 steps. Can we build a species distribution model for fish abundance using current data? And so for abundance, we needed gear and effort information. And then can we hindcast or predict into the past to get relative abundance of that historical time period? And then can we compare predictions and see how well did our model do, and use these data to see if they would be good enough to predict for climate change in the future. So our goal here was to investigate changes in species abundance over time and how well our models would do at predicting that change. This is similar to studies that build models using current data and forecast in the future, but we don't have future data to validate with. So we wanted to kind of go the opposite way with our modeling approach. So we decided to use largemouth bass as our focus species for the study. As I mentioned, largemouth bass is a warm water adapted species. And they're also a really, really popular recreational sport fish across North America. And so there's a lot of good data on them, and they're extensively sampled in Michigan. So in order to do this comparison of historical and contemporary data, we need good historical data. So the Institute for Fisheries Research here in Michigan has a lot of this data. They did historical lake surveys, and this is an awesome picture from one of those surveys in 1933, there on the left. However, these data are all in index cards, as you can see in the photo on the right. Every folder is a lake, and within each of those folders, there are a variety of index cards from the sampling events. And here's a few examples of what those cards look like. So they're super data rich. They have information on the characteristics of the lake, including things like temperature, Secchi disk, oxygen, all of these things. And then there are also cards that have fish catch information. And these cards not only included the number of fish caught, so an estimate of abundance, but also sometimes included gear and effort, which we need to be able to estimate abundance. But in a filing cabinet, these data are not usable. So we launched a project using crowdsourcing platform. In this case, we used a platform called Zooniverse. And I won't go into too many details, but this is just an example of what that platform looks like online. And so Zooniverse has over 2 million users that are interested in contributing to studies of biodiversity. Our project, we ended up with volunteers from around the world transcribing these cards for us. And what we did was set up these workflows, as you can see on the right-hand side, with specific fields that we thought were important, that we wanted data about. And some of the options are drop down, which are really nice because they're very standardized. And some of the information had to be entered as like a text field, which were a little bit harder to get consensus. But every card was looked at by at least 4 volunteers so that we could see how consistent the answers were across volunteers. And by the end of this project, we had over 2,800 volunteers that did over 450,000 classifications and 136,000 subjects or cards. And this whole transcription process took about 8 months. So for this specific project and looking at the largemouth bass, I ended up using around 13,000 cards and data from these cards. The data that I was able to get ranged from 1936 to 1964. And I have an example of the cards here. You can see, well, this is an example of yellow perch, but there was the number that were caught. And then there was also that gear information. So they used a common sense seine and 20 hauls. So I was able to use those data for the historical part. And then the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, they've been doing contemporary status and trends lake surveys for about 20 years. And so I was able to use their information from 2003 to 2019 to be able to compare those trends in largemouth bass abundance. So now that we have all this data, we can look at those changes in abundance over space and over time. So this gives you an idea of the distribution of data that I was able to collect. So the blue are the contemporary points, and we ended up with data for 255 lakes across Michigan for the contemporary period and 83 lakes for the historical period. Pretty good distribution across the state. And you can see those gray lines are the fisheries management unit boundaries that the Department of Natural Resources has for their management regions. And there are 8 of those across the state. So briefly, I'm not going to get into details of the model. You can read the manuscript if you're interested in that. But just to give you a visual of kind of the important parts of what went into the model was it had this nested structure. So we had those 8 fisheries management units that can help account for differences in space and also in potential management practices across the state. And then if you think about nested within that, you've got all of your lakes and nested within lakes, you have different samples using different gears. And we wanted to be able to capture all of those gears, not just select one, and be able to look at differences across gear types as well. And so we have data for seine, gillnet, electrofishing, and pike and trap netting. So you'll see some results from all of those different types of gears. And then the environmental data that went into these models to help explain where largemouth bass were occurring. We tried a variety of variables and ended up with this final set of variables that have a lot of ecological relevance and also are not correlated with each other. So we have some variables that describe the morphometry of a lake, so lake depth and lake area. Water clarity was measured by Secchi depth. Some natural watershed influences, so percent of wetland within the watershed or the percent of forest within the watershed of a specific lake. And then for our climate variables, we had yearly averages of surface water temperature. And then to account for potential effects of the season or maybe biases depending on when the samples were taken, we included the day of the year that the sampling occurred. So now for a few results. This is a plot that shows the effect of each environmental variable there along the y-axis. And then the value along the x-axis is the strength of that effect. And so 0 would be no effect or no discernible effect. And values that are positive have a positive effect on abundance, and negative would have a negative effect. And I've highlighted those in blue that don't cross 0. So they have a fairly strong effect on relative abundance that we saw across the state. And so we see that surface water temperature has a strong positive influence on largemouth bass. So as we would expect, as temperature increases, we see an increase in largemouth bass abundance. We see a similar positive influence of Secchi, so clear lakes showed higher abundance as compared to the more turbid lakes in our study. And then we actually saw a negative effect of lake area. And this is because we were using fish density as our measure. And so if you think about the larger lakes having more deep water and smaller nearshore habitat where largemouth bass like to hang out, then you'll get kind of a lower overall density with those larger lakes. So you get a negative trend there. So these are not necessarily new results. Other studies have looked at, what influences where largemouth bass are in lakes. But we also had those different gears. So we could look at these same graphs to see if we saw similar different trends across gear types. And so in general, the same surface temperature and Secchi depth and lake area are the most influential in all of these gear types. However, one interesting thing that we do see by looking at the 4 different gear types is that day of year can be really important, especially in gill netting and in seining. And so this could just be part of a sampling bias of what day of the year were these samples being taken. A lot of times, or largemouth bass spawn in the spring, and so you'll get a lot more of those small young of year fish, and they'll be more abundant sampling those nearshore habitats in the spring. So you might see that might be an effect of the day of year. It would strongly influence catches during that time. So it's really interesting, I think, to be able to see those differences across gear types, but also see a lot of similarities. And most importantly, surface temperature has that positive effect no matter what gear type you are looking at. So that's consistent across all the gears. So if we get a little bit more into looking at temperature, we used these models and hindcasted or predicted into the past, changing the temperature to the historical time period temperature. And so this map shows you the estimated relative density of the historical time period. So the darker colors are higher density and the lighter colors are lower density of largemouth bass across the state. And so we see in general, those higher densities occur in the southern part of the state, and lower in the northern and UP across Michigan. So then we looked at the change in temperature, or not change in temperature, the change in density from the historical to the current time period. And so the whiter color, there's like no change in density over time. The darker purple or lighter purple are increases, and the greens are decreases. And so we see a lot of no change in the Upper Peninsula, so mostly that white color. Some decreasing abundance in the lower part of the Lower Peninsula, and a lot of the increasing abundance is seen in the upper part of the Lower Peninsula. So this makes sense because the positive relationship between temperature and density, we know that temperature is going to have a really big influence on where we're seeing those increases or decreases in density from the historical to the contemporary time period. So if we look at the actual change in temperature from the historical to the contemporary time period, it's really different across the state. So this can explain some of those patterns. We see in some areas the temperature change from the historical to the contemporary is increased, but there's also some where it's showing that the temperature was actually cooler over that time period, which explains why some of these were predicted to have decreased in density. But we know that temperature was not the only thing that had an effect, right? So lake area also had a big effect on species abundance. So I looked at this plot, which shows you do see temperature change here on the bottom axis. So that's the change from the historical to the contemporary period. And then the estimated relative density. So we see that positive relationship, but there's a lot of variation. And so I plotted the color of based on lake area. And the larger lakes are those darker colors. The smaller lakes are the lighter greens and yellows. And so you can sort of start to see a trend here of these really dark purple, some of them are hidden, lakes are kind of more towards that no change in temperature, whereas a lot of the lighter yellows and light greens are changing, either increasing or decreasing in temperature more over time. And so again, you've got temperature influencing abundance, but you also have to think about some of those other confounding factors like lake area. Smaller water bodies are going to warm or cool more quickly than larger water bodies. So not all lakes are going to change the same or at the same rate over time when we think about changing climate. So things get really complicated. So I looked at just one species, largemouth bass, that warm water adapted species. But what if we think about entire fish communities? So Kevin Worley and others published this paper in 2012, and they developed this lake classification of fish assemblages across Michigan. So they had 6 classes there in different colors. And their warmer tones were the warm water species, were the oranges and reds are warm water species, dominant lakes, and the cooler tones represented the cool and cold water species dominant lakes. And their classification was based on 3 variables. So they used degree days, average temperature, water temperature, and lake surface area. So those are similar variables to what came out as important in my models. And originally in this paper, they used a climate average over 30 years for this classification. So since then, they've really been considering how these classifications might change over time with a changing climate. Would everything change consistently, or would they vary in their response to changes over time? And so they took this classification and they used a modeling approach to, again, similarly, hindcast and see how these fish assemblages would change over time. And now instead of 30 years, they have 125 years of temperature data. So they first broke out each of these time periods into 25-year time periods. My slides are now advancing on their own, which I'm not sure why. And so these colors represent the change from average. So you can see that the cool colors, again, the blues, represent colder than average temperatures. The darker reds represent warmer than average temperatures. And so this might be masking, year to year variability in temperature, but it does show that Michigan's climate has been highly variable through time. So you've got periods of cooling and warming, and they're not consistent statewide. So what I find really interesting is, depending on which time period you're looking at, you're going to see changes where you've got the really cool time period here, but over here you've got some that haven't changed, some that are warmer, some that are cooler. Again, from 1970 to 94, you're getting some more cooler than average changes. And I wanted to highlight that the time period that I used for my study was in this 45 to 69 range, where you've got that variety of average temperature, warmer than average, and cooler than average temperature. And so depending on what time period you're looking at, might really affect your predictions and your models. And so these are some of the figures that they created of those lake classes in these different temperature periods to see how would lakes shift with the changing climate. And what stands out to me most, I think, is again, the UP is in general has those cold water and cool water fish assemblages, again, in those purple and blue. But what's changing the most is in the upper lower here. I think you're getting some of those cool water species, then they're kind of disappearing. They might come back. And then especially in the last, 20 years, they're disappearing again. And you're getting more orange or warm water assemblages in the UP in the most recent years compared to the very earliest time period. And so we can see how the response of individual lakes to climate are really variable. And those communities are going to change differently over time and over space. And one thing that they plan to do is use the historical data that's transcribed from the cards that I talked about earlier to test their predictions in these shifting communities, to see if they can identify some of the communities in these lakes and if they match up with these lake classes that they've been predicting. So to summarize, over the past decades, largemouth bass densities we found across the state are predicted to have decreased in some areas. So in that southern part of the lower peninsula, they were increasing in the northern lower peninsula, and upper peninsula was mostly the same. There's similar patterns when you think about the entire communities, those warm, cool, and cold water fish species. They're predicted to shift differently over time and also over space, so over the entire state. And so these patterns suggest that fish assemblages to future climate change are going to be really complicated, and predicting those responses are going to be really challenging. And so, as we saw both in the example from Worley and my example, that temperature change is not consistent across the state. So maybe this generates more questions than really providing answers, but I think that this historical data set that we've been able to use to validate these models has been a really important first step to looking at these trends over space and over time. And finally, I just wanted to acknowledge everyone that was either a co-author or helped digitize these historical data. So I already talked about all the Zooniverse volunteers, this other diverse interdisciplinary team that we had at U of M and Department of Natural Resources, as well as undergrads. None of this could have been possible without all of these people. So it wasn't just my effort alone. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Katelyn. That's really cool stuff. I feel like I could look at those maps, especially of the classifications, for a long, long time. So,
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, a lot to unpack.
for sure, for sure. So, I guess first I'd just say on behalf of the participants and the attendees here today that thank you. I think this is super interesting, and appreciate you offering the presentation. If folks have questions for Katelyn, feel free to enter them into the question and answer function. So again, you can do that by taking your mouse and hovering it over the bottom of the screen. And then it'll say Q&A. Click on that button and you can fire away and ask your questions for Katelyn. I don't see any questions in the chat at this point. Oh, I was wrong. We got one here. All right. So the question is, 50% of inland lakes have poor habitat, and fish community change appears to be aligned similar to the gradient of shoreline alteration. How might historical shoreline alteration explain many of the changes involved, observed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that shoreline altercation probably has a lot to do with it. So we and at least in my study, we did not include that as a factor. But there is some information on like number of houses that were observed while they were doing the sampling, number of boat liveries, things like that, that might be able to use to look at some of those impacts. One thing with the historical data is it's very spotty what kind of variables you're able to get. And so from my memory, there wasn't a lot of information on that, but obviously that is going to have a huge impact, especially when you're looking at a lake by lake on a like by like basis, more at that local scale. And I think that's really important. At the broad state scale, I'm not sure that we had the data to look at that, but as I said, temperature is one factor, lake area is one factor. Secchi depth was important, and I know that there's a lot of volunteer data on secchi depth that's happening right now, and so all those data are really great, along with the shoreline scoring data, to look at the effects that those would be having over time. The issue is just like, can we find data that's similar to that, back from that 1940s and 50s time period?
Yeah. Yeah, and it just goes to the importance of long-term monitoring programs where you've consistently laid out sampling protocols that capture the things that you think might be important in the future. Because
Right.
somebody back in the 40s, was designing something, they might not have been envisioning that development that's occurred on our shorelines or any of these other factors. I suspect your answer to this next question will be kind of similar to or build on your last response, but the question was, how is fish density affected by HABs, harmful algal blooms? And so anyway, I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's just not, again, that's not something that we had data on. Harmful algal blooms are getting worse, and they're becoming more and more of an issue, I think, in the, recent decades. And so, um, again, like you said, Joe, that might not have been something that they were thinking of back in the 40s and the 50s. And so, um, we don't really have um, good, even like nutrient data or chlorophyll data or things like that. So, um, unfortunately, that's not something that we can compare at this time for that, hunt for like 100-year difference. So,
Yeah, thanks. All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I have questions as always. But if folks participating in the webinar have additional questions, feel free to ask them. Um, Katelyn, I guess my first question is kind of, do you have next steps for this research, and where do you intend to take it anywhere from here, and if so, where?
um, yeah, that's a great question. I am currently on a different project, so I don't have next steps for this research. There would be a opportunity to look at some of the cool and cold water species. So initially that was one thing that we were interested in. So we looked at largemouth bass, but wanting to look at like walleye and cisco, which I mentioned at the beginning, um, and look at similar trends over time and see if we could predict those species changes as well. These models did really well for largemouth bass, but not sure, how well would they do for cold and cool water species. Um, and then, Kevin's work, I think, is ongoing. Those aren't published yet, but I think separately, we developed these models and then saw these similar patterns, which I think was really like compelling evidence for some of the results. And I think that now that they have these predictions of what what are the communities that they would expect to be there, based on their temperature and lake area, and if they could validate those with the data that we do have on the cards, and um, to see if because those cards have all of the species that they found during that survey. So you could, I looked at one species, they're looking at entire communities, and essentially you could validate and see if that's what the community looked like, and probably a subset of those lakes from their predictions. So hopefully that's their plan.
Yeah. There's a ton of opportunity with that data set. It's such a cool data set.
Yeah, I think there are so many ideas. It's now that the data are like digital and they're, going to be available. It's just about having the person power to look at the data and analyze data. So,
Um, all right, we've got another question in terms of the data. So, how reliable were they, and was that reliability? Were there metrics measuring the confidence or the accuracy of the data?
um, yeah, that's a good question. So as far as um the data themselves, um, we were very careful to select, at least for our modeling project, um, data that were very specific in their methods. So um, I think reliability might depend on what you're using the data for. And so, like for instance, there are a lot of cards that didn't have the amount of detail that we deemed necessary to be included in the model. So if it only had gear but didn't have any information on, the number of hauls or the times that they were set or things like that, then we felt like they weren't reliable enough to use, and so they weren't used. Um, so um, I think in that way we were pretty selective in what we used. Um, but yeah, some of the cards were very detailed, and I think were really, really reliable, and some of the others maybe less so. So I think it sort of depends on what you want to use the data for, but their methods, I think it was still through the Institute of Fisheries Research, so they still had somewhat standardized methods, and so in that way, I think Secchi depth, things like that, are pretty consistent over time. And um, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the multiple data entries for each card probably helped a ton with the
Yeah. Yeah.
quality
So
control.
if you're talking about like the actual, source data versus getting from the card to digitized, um, that we did a lot of quality control on. And yeah, like you said, Joe, we had 4 people look at every card, and um, if there was over 50% consensus, then we accepted that answer. If there was, 50%, so like half and half or less, then we actually had a researcher review those answers and decide what, what the correct thing was. And a lot of times there might be a smudge on the card, or they're really hard to read or something like that. So um, but as far as, yeah, there was a lot of quality control going from the um, card information to the digital version. And that took a lot of time. So,
Yeah, and a ton of volunteer hours too. So
yeah.
pretty cool. Have you guys shared any of these studies with angler groups? I can imagine a bass angling group, for example, being really interested in these data and the patterns that they're showing, or maybe other angling groups as well.
Um, no, at the moment we haven't done that, but that's a really good idea. I am working on um, making a story map for dissemination to groups like, yeah, anglers, or a lot of the volunteers. We wanted to have some sort of product that we could say, thank you for volunteering, transcribing these data. Um, Here are some of the results that we found. So I've been working on that with a lot of pictures and visuals and maps that show kind of these initial results in more of a a friendly way for anybody to be able to look at them. That's not done yet, but that is part of the plan in sharing some of these results.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's great. I'm sure they'll be super interested to see that. I'd be curious to see the story map that you put together.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're also working on a data paper so that all of these data will be published and available. But that's hopefully will be done, hopefully will be submitted by the end of the summer is our goal right now. So
Gotcha. Um, do you know, are there any interest? So I'm thinking of um, there's a paper that Hansen and others wrote that looked at changes in expected changes in walleye and largemouth bass populations over time, and we expect to see in Wisconsin that there'll be more bass and fewer walleye. And there's some questions about, kind of what the mechanisms are, but attributing that to climate change. And I guess I'm curious whether, you guys were looking at largemouth bass, whether a covariate of walleye was ever considered, or if there's any interest in that, pursuing that line of thinking in the future.
yeah, there's definitely the ability to do that and to look at multiple species at one time. One of the challenges that we had was the way that the model is written and using all four of those gears. So we had to estimate the catchability for every gear. And so if we wanted to use other species in the model, we would also have to estimate the catchability for those species, think about their densities as well. So it would be really complicated really fast. So we didn't do that in this case, but I think that you could easily do something similar. I believe they maybe selected gill netting in their study, so you could do something similar where you just pulled gill netting, and I think you could look at multiple species.
Thanks. All right, I've got another question from the audience. So, are there strategies that our association can adopt or consider to prevent the shift from a cool cold to a warm water fish community over time?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. Um, Yeah, I think what comes to mind like right away are some of those like shoreline adaptations. So things like trees and shading can really help keep lakes cool. Um, if there hasn't already been too much um, degradation of the shoreline. Um, trying to think of any others that you would be able to do like as a lake association. Um, I don't know, Joe, if you have any input as a manager on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've seen a number of folks have success with, especially in Minnesota um, and a little bit in Wisconsin, is looking to build resilience for cool and cold water fishes by um, trying to increase the amount of oxygen in those colder bottom waters so that as the lake warms, um, it's going to be pretty hard to change the temperature and the stratification within the lake. But if the fish that require cold water can just swim deeper and find that colder water by swimming deeper, then that allows them a way to adapt to the climate change. And in order for them to do that, they've got to have oxygen down deep. So strategies that mitigate the effects of climate change by reducing nutrients to the lake and allow fish to access those well oxygenated bottom waters. So things like um, preserving protected, natural land covers like forests or grasslands in the watershed, reducing septic inputs, as you mentioned, the overland runoff and shoreline best management practices, those sorts of things. That would be the first thing I would think of.
Yeah, good point. There's not really a way to stop the lake from warming, but can try to conserve some of that good habitat.
Yeah. And the other thing that we see is an increased use of stocking, for some cold and cool water fishes, cool water fish. I'm thinking of walleye. We're stocking walleye has been an adaptive measure to addressing the lost recruitment that we've seen for walleye across the upper Midwest. So that's a common strategy as well. All right. At this point, I think I will issue a last call for questions if anybody has questions. And otherwise we'll wrap up. So and in the meantime, Katelyn, again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your research with us. Super cool. And really appreciate you sharing the presentation. So seeing no more questions, I'll wrap this up. I encourage folks to attend the future MGLP webinars. You can find the whole list of those on our website. We've got a lot of great webinars coming up as well. So I look forward to seeing you guys in the future, and thank you for all you do for our lakes. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.